All right, well, while the very final last people are trickling in, quite the popular panel, this is exciting. I will introduce our panelists. You have their bios in the program, so I'm not just going to read their bios. But of course, Randi Weingarten is the president of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the biggest labor unions in the country. A longtime friend of J Street, active on our issues. We're very excited to have her with us today. Peter Beinart is, of course, a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York, among many other things. Our friend Karen Finney is the former senior spokesperson for Hillary Clinton's campaign and has had many other clients as well. She's an independent consultant, and you'll frequently see her on MSNBC. CNN, I was testing her. She's definitely adhering to the word of her contract. Good job. And then Jim Gerstein is, of course, a pollster with GBAO Strategies and J Street's pollster, the one who's been behind the polls we've been doing every election night now for 10 years. So round of applause for Jim. I'm Ben Schneider. I'm J Street's Vice President of Political Affairs and Strategy. Thank you for joining us for this panel. So we're going to talk this afternoon about Israel and the 2020 elections. Not a lot to talk about. The way I would like to structure this, we're not going to do opening statements. We may do closing statements. We'll see how things go. But I'm going to ask just a few questions of each of the panelists. And then we'll open up the mic here because I'd like everybody to get an opportunity who would like to ask a question as well. And there might be some back and forth in between. But we're going to just dive right in. So to start things off, and we've got water coming down for the panelists. Thank you, Cecilia. To start things off, last night, opening night of the conference with the live taping of Pod Save the World. Jim, I'm going to start with you. We heard a lot of talk last night about turning Israel into a political wedge, which is definitely something that this president is already seeking to do. One thing that we didn't hear about last night, though, is the numbers. So just to kick things off right out the gate, Jim, we see this president trying to turn Israel into that political wedge, maybe cleave some Jews away from the Democratic Party. How likely is this to work? If not, why not? If so, then why?
So I would be shocked if Jews flock to the to President Trump's re-election effort. What we've seen in the last election, 2018 is our latest guidepost. What we saw in the 2018 election is that more Jews voted for the Democratic candidate than they had voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So in the midterm election, the question is, was that because of the rising tide of that Democrats had in 2018 in the wave that we enjoyed, or is there something unique about Donald Trump that particularly angers Jewish voters? I mean, he has a lot that particularly angers everybody, but is there something unique to Jewish voters? And we don't know the answer to that yet. But there are signs, there are indications that things like Charlottesville and the coddling of white nationalists and the appeal, they're not even really dog whistles, but the public appeals to white nationalists strike a chord with some Jewish voters who are not necessarily in the automatic Democratic camp, which constitutes about 70% of Jewish voters, but are actually some of those who are wavering, and that may be something that just, one, moves them over more to the Democratic column, and also activates the Democratic Jewish voters even further. So I would just say that his efforts to appeal to Jewish voters by an occasional line about moving the embassy to Jerusalem, or how he's the prophet or whatever he's saying at that moment, but those things don't work. One, because they're so hostile to him as an individual and his policies on a range of issues, but two, because they don't necessarily agree with the policies that he's pushing from a U.S.-Israel relationship perspective. So just I'll end this question with the point that when he says that Jews who vote Democratic are either misinformed or not loyal, that's the kind of thing that actually will move Jews to vote more for the Democratic candidate.
Randy, I want to come over to you. What opportunity is there here with this president trying to maneuver Israel into a wedge issue? What opportunity is there to, instead of going by the rules of the old playbook and just simply hugging as tight as possible a far-right Likud government at every turn, to draw a sharp distinction and redefine through contrast what it actually means to be pro-Israel on the Democratic side?
So that's a big question. By the way, if there are any Nats fans here, you can say that my red is for the Nationals. However, I'm actually wearing it because of it is the color of the Chicago Teachers Union, and they are on strike now. However, that point I'm making is that there could be common values between the World Series and the strike in Chicago. So I think the question, Ben, is that the one thing we need to actually understand and recognize about Trump, and the New Yorkers in the room actually know this because they lived with him or watched him for all these years, is that he is the best snake oil salesman one knows. And he is expert at going for the wedge. And that assuming that he could then go for the wedge and then talk about it over and over and over again, and given that he now has, or they now have Fox and all these other legions of entities, it can be in your Facebook feed, all the time. And so it's then really hard to reframe when that then becomes a narrative, and then we are then responding to that narrative all the time. And so it's kind of like, when did you stop beating your wife? There's like no win to having to respond to that narrative. But I would actually then take a step back, because Jim's polling is really fantastic. I'd take a step back and say this: we should do everything we can to reframe the narrative and make it values-based. And let me just give an example. The narrative here is Israel, it does everything right. Like, when did anybody in this room abide by that about America? Seriously. And I suspect most of us are patriots, not Patriot fans, but patriots. But
Some of us are both. Yeah.
Okay. As the Giants are already losing 7-0 to the Lions. But my point is, it's Israel has a right to exist. We all believe that. Israel has a right to exist as a democratic Jewish state. I think most of us believe that. But that's really, really different than everything Israel does is right. And so I would actually say we can actually push back on that framing, and giving the polling, I would actually say don't be afraid to push back from it. And ultimately, so the issue becomes, what are our values about Israel? But equally important, what are our values about who we are? And this is kind of where I want to end here, which is, most of us still see ourselves as a stranger in our own land, as an immigrant, as a refugee. And we climbed that ladder of opportunity. And essentially, what Trump is trying to do is say to all of us, okay, just get rid of that ladder after you've climbed it. Forget about 1924. Forget about all that discrimination against Jews and others when we did not have where we are right now. And I bet on the Jewish people that we talk to that they will remember more about that than about Trump's vitriol and divisiveness. And I think that's why Jews are actually with more of democratic principles than not, because they remember being the stranger. They remember discrimination. They remember the issues of democracy and of freedom. And I think we have to reframe this to, we have certain values. Yes, Israel as a Jewish democratic state. But that also means civil rights for everyone. And it also means, and we can have different views about what freedom means. To me, freedom means also a two-state solution, but it also means basic freedom. Those are our values here. Those need to be our values there. And I don't see an inconsistency. The issue is we need to lean in and talk to people about it.
So Karen, I want to turn to you. From Jim's polling, it would seem that Randy's prescription for how a Democratic candidate ought to approach this issue of putting forward a progressive worldview both at home and abroad makes a whole lot of sense, both in terms of being a consistent messenger and in terms of the polls themselves and the data as we see it. So as somebody who's been in the room where it's happening quite a bit, with candidates who are trying to find the path of least resistance on this issue, why is it that still so often it takes so much to make the point that Randy just made, break through and stick with a candidate about how to articulate their vision on Israel?
I think in part because, and by the way, the Patriots are cheaters, just going to say that. I had to, I'm sorry. You can't give me a mic and think I won't say that. Anyway, I think it's because...
This panel is no longer going to be civil, is it?
Right. We agree on Israel, just not...
We found a wedge issue.
We found a wedge, right. Look, I want to start by saying that one of the things that I do think that Trump has done is to make, at least for me, make a lot of these issues much more bright lines, right? If you can't say the KKK is bad, right, that shouldn't be hard. And when you see the kind of violence that we've seen at synagogues, at random events where people are gathering, I'm thinking of Texas, where a guy was going after Latinos because Trump says they're bad, right? So I think we're in this moment where some of these distinctions are more clear than maybe they used to be, but I think the other challenge has been for so long, and I remember I started in politics in 1992, and Bill Clinton talking about a two-state solution, and that was there was a lot of political work that had to go into being able to say that, and it be a little bit risky politically, but the place where we were trying to move to. And so I just think it's amazing that we're now able to talk about this as in the frame that, as Randy said, freedom, and talk about the Palestinians. And I do think that, Bernie Sanders, in 2016, Senator Sanders, I think, really helped push that conversation. I wish he would have done it in a slightly different tone, but it was important to have those issues on the table. And the challenge with candidates is, particularly if it's not an issue, I'll just be very frank, that you're not comfortable with or you feel like you don't know a lot about, except for abortion issues. Men like to feel perfectly fine talking about that. But and having seen political repercussions, right, if you don't get it right. So a lot of times, I've worked with candidates who say, just tell me what to say, just because I don't want to screw this up. What's not just the path of least resistance, but what is going to not get me in trouble? And so what is, I think, happened, though, is we're now able to have a more nuanced conversation. We're able to have a deeper conversation, and it's still work. I know J Street has done a lot of work taking some of this polling, talking with candidates, talking with people like me who work with candidates, to show them the numbers to say, look, here's the proof that it's okay to say this. And the other thing I would say is, again, then you have Trump out there sort of, again, this sort of bright line that says, well, wait a second, I'm not him. I'm not going to associate with that kind of hatred, which he's kind of a, love all, serve all when it comes to racism and bigotry, right? Nobody is safe. And so I hope that part of what that is doing is helping people and candidates feel even more comfortable, right? Because the opposite is so ugly and so, as Randy said, against our values, just as human beings, that I think it is making it a little bit easier. I just had a conversation with a candidate, House candidate that I'm working with, who actually met with J Street last Monday. And it was pretty easy to say, look, we want to talk about a two-state solution, but you can be a supporter of Israel and disagree with some things, and it's okay. So we've seen that move, but I do think that's why the polling matters, because I think people are still getting comfortable with what we can say and how we can say it.
Great. So Peter, let's pick up on that and talk about where the conversation on Israel on the campaign trail currently stands versus where it stood last presidential cycle and in presidential cycles of yore. So we have the polling. We've got some of the additional political space that Karen and Randy have alluded to, and you've written a fair amount about how some of the candidates on the trail are breaking new ground in terms of the policy prescriptions they're putting out there and might put out there in the future. Speak a little bit about that new ground you see being broken and where you think we'll end up by the end of the cycle.
I think we've gotten to a place where some people are starting to understand that it's not enough to say you support a two-state solution. It's not even enough to say you don't like Benjamin Netanyahu and you disagree with some of his policies. The conversation that's coming in the Democratic Party, and I think quickly, is a conversation about American complicity and a conversation about American money. I don't think you can honestly and coherently say that you support a two-state solution and you want to restrict settlement growth and you want to honor the humanity of Palestinians. I mean, Israel is a wedge issue between the two parties for the same reason that gay marriage and abortion and the rights of asylum seekers are wedge issues, because the two parties have fundamentally different values. One party fundamentally sees, or at least privately is willing to say, sees Palestinians as human beings. The other party doesn't, right? One party recognizes that Palestinians deserve the basic rights that we all want. Another party essentially is fine with Israel controlling them permanently without giving them basic rights. But I don't think, to go back to the point I was making, I don't think it's coherent to say we want to stop settlement growth. We want a Palestinian state, and yet America is going to give Israel almost $4 billion in no strings attached aid, right? How can you say that you believe that Palestinians are human beings who have the basic rights and say that it's okay for American money to be used to detain Palestinian children, or for American money to be used to bulldoze Palestinian homes for when people's only offense is not having a building permit that as permanent citizens under military law they are not able to get, right? So I think that's the question. About virtually any other country in the world, it would be an obvious question, right? That if we have a government that is doing things that are fundamentally antithetical to the Democratic Party's values of equality, right, and liberal democracy, then that we would not subsidize them to do things that crush people and deny them their basic rights. The reason that conversation I think, has only been broached so far by Bernie Sanders is that I think Bernie Sanders, to go to Karen's point, I think Bernie Sanders and the people around him are comfortable with this issue. They feel like they know the issue well. They feel like they're ready for that battle, and they also understand what many people understand when they actually wade into this, which is that the arguments of the other side are extraordinarily weak, right? And that when you actually don't shrink from the fight, and you actually just talk about the basic conditions on the ground to Democrats, right, that in fact it's not a very difficult argument to make. I'm waiting for Elizabeth Warren and some of the other candidates to take that step. I simply don't think it's consistent with their values not to. And I understand that this can seem terrifying to presidential candidates who are not used to kind of living with this in the way that some of us do in all of our lives. But I would simply say that people need to trust themselves and what they believe, right? People like Elizabeth Warren know what their values are. They know what they believe. You don't have to have a PhD or be able to recite your bar mitzvah portion in order to be able to apply those principles to a situation where Palestinians have fewer rights in the West Bank than a black person in Mississippi in 1953.
Can I just add one?
So,
Can I add
yeah,
one
go
thing?
ahead, Karen.
So, actually, to that point, this morning I saw an article about, I think she was in South Carolina doing a town hall, Elizabeth Warren, and she was asked, the question was, I think something to the effect of, would you support sanctions if, with Israel, if they don't stop with the settlements, right? And her answer, she said, well, obviously if that happened, then everything would be on the table. And the reporter came back and said, okay, but does that mean you would support sanctions? And she just said, like I said, everything's on the table. Now, since I'm not affiliated with any campaign, I don't know specifically what her thinking was, but to the point that Peter's making, and to the point I was making, I don't think she was comfortable with what to say as an answer. Clearly, she needs to come talk to J Street, no question. But, but I think and I was surprised at that, actually. And I think that's part of where the conversation hopefully will evolve on the campaign trail, that we can have this kind of conversation, a values-based conversation. But I think that's part of why you're still seeing some hesitance from people.
So I just want to pitch it back to Peter on one quick thing, and then I'm going to get to Jim and Randy too. So Peter, there are some, just to draw this out a little bit more, of the top tier of candidates, we've seen 3 talk about aid in some fashion. We have seen Warren allude, as Karen said, to leveraging aid in some fashion, putting everything on the table at least. We've seen Bernie talk about it as part of a more coherent vision, like you alluded to. We've seen Pete talk about making sure that U.S. taxpayer dollars aren't spent on annexation. So draw for me some of the distinctions you see there, and I just want to take the moderator's prerogative quickly to note that 3 of the top tier candidates saying anything about aid this cycle is a pretty hell of a long way from 2016, isn't it?
Right. Yes. The Democratic Party is moving in the right direction. That's the good news. The bad news is that events on the ground, right, fueled by the Trump administration, are moving in the wrong direction, arguably even faster, right? And so it's to Pete Buttigieg's credit that he said that if Israel wants to formally annex the West Bank, then they can do so without American money. That's good. The question I would ask is, why is it okay to de jure annex the West Bank? It's not okay to de jure annex the West Bank with American money, but it's okay to de facto annex the West Bank with American money, because that's what the Israeli government has been doing very obviously, right? If annexation is wrong, then American money for settlement growth is wrong, because American money for settlement growth is a process of de facto annexation. And so Bernie has gone the furthest, and I think that he needs to flesh out a little bit exactly what that policy is. I think, to me, again, the McCollum bill, which basically says no U.S. money for children in detention, should be a no-brainer. No U.S. money for demolition of Palestinian homes should be a no-brainer. And I would say that unless Israel stops the settlement subsidies and commits to a Palestinian state near the Green Line, I wouldn't cut off all military aid. I mean, I think that there are legitimate needs for American military aid to do things like fund Iron Dome and Arrow and protect Israelis from rockets. But I think you could certainly say, I don't want to go on too long, but one of the things that a lot of people don't recognize is that we have something called offshore procurement. Most U.S. military aid is basically you give them a check and they have to spend it on American weapons. Israel can spend 25% of its money on Israeli weaponry, right? Even for a Trump kind of nativist nationalist perspective, it makes no sense that Israel is taking American money and spending it to develop their own arms industry. I would say we could at least say no more American money to buy Israeli weapons unless Israel actually commits to a viable two-state solution. And that's where I hope the candidates would get. And I think Warren is moving in that direction, but she has a ways to go.
So I see both Jim and Randy want to get in on this point as well. So Randy, do you want to go first?
I think, I love that Peter actually pushes them and pushes us to where we ought to be and where they ought to be. I think that I just want to take a step back to say what Trump tried to do with the moving of the Israeli embassy, and that no Democrats showed up at that event, notwithstanding what the kind of conventional wisdom would have been of, oh, you want to show up at all of these things. The fact that Schumer is showing up at the gala, Chuck Schumer, the minority leader of the Senate, who's never shown up at a J Street event, is showing up at the gala tomorrow night, is a really big deal. It's showing that this, what was thought of as you just have to hide and say everything that Israel does is right, is no longer the practice of the Democratic Party. That is a huge shift. It is not enough, as Peter argues, but I do want to actually, look, I'm a school teacher. I like to reward good behavior. And I do think we actually should reward some of that good behavior, and I think we're seeing in the polling some of that as well.
Thanks, Randy. And now, Jim, so, where J Street comes at this question of aid is that, U.S. taxpayer dollars shouldn't be spent on actions that are counter to U.S. and Israeli security interests, and some of this stuff would fit that bill, but not necessarily lessening the aggregate amount of aid in such a case. But talk a little bit, Jim, about, I know you've done polling on this of Democrats. There's been some polling of this of general election voters, and then you've done polling around this of American Jews. Talk about those three groups and how they're likely to react to this in different contexts.
Right. So the first thing I would say is it's on J Street's website, this poll that we did in May of 2019 among likely voters in the Democratic primary and caucuses in 2020. And it's really interesting to see the sea change that may not necessarily be with voters, but the sea change in the dynamic. And whether or not it is, because the sea change being that the playbook, as Ben Schneider likes to say, the playbook has changed. And whether that is because voters have changed or whether J Street has given voice to those attitudes that were not being that were not being expressed by existing institutions and organizations. I think those views had always been there, but they'd just not been getting the voice. And it is, you see it also with the Iran agreement. Because Randy referenced how none of the Democrats came to the event for the Jerusalem, the move of the embassy to Jerusalem. Go back a couple years to the debate over whether or not to support the Iran agreement. This was policy number one, objective number one of Netanyahu and AIPAC. And the coverage of this and the debate in the United States was there are two sides to this debate. And actually the majority of Jews in America supported the Iran agreement, and it even got stronger after Netanyahu came to John Boehner's Congress and spoke against the Democratic president that all these Jewish voters had supported. So there is a sea change in the overall dynamic, and we can't, I think we can't lose sight of that, and honestly we can't lose sight of the role that folks in this room and that this organization have played in changing that dynamic. Now, in terms of how people view the issue of aid, in that survey that we did of Democratic primary voters in May of this year, we saw that just as the broader general electorate isn't thrilled with the U.S. throwing, or that's a little too pejorative, with the U.S. spending money overseas without any strings attached or without any holding the people accountable, the people that we're giving money to accountable. And that is not to say that that means you go and condition it on investigating your political rivals, but that they do, that's not where the American people are. Where the American people are, and the Democratic primary electorate is that they want to know that U.S. money is being spent in line with American values and being spent with some accountability to it. And that actually applies to the great state of Israel as well. And that is something that had never been polled or never asked before, and I think sheds light on where there is political room to be talking about these things. I think tone is very important. I think that what we see with Democratic primary voters is that they support Israel, they like Israel, they are knowledgeable about Israel, they're knowledgeable about these issues, but they also want the United States to be an honest broker who can help both sides reach peace. And these are overwhelming numbers, both among the Democratic primary electorate as well as among American Jews. My favorite number in that poll, or favorite question, had to do with whether or not, is a favorability question. We ask a bunch of things of whether people are favorable or unfavorable towards. Towards the state of Israel, Democratic primary voters had a plus 25 favorable over unfavorable view of the state of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu had a minus 27. That's pretty remarkable that you would have voters where this is not Jewish voters, but by the way, they're not thrilled with Netanyahu either, but these are Democratic primary voters who this is not an issue that is near and dear to their heart, but they are knowledgeable about it. And to the extent that they can distinguish, and that they do distinguish between their support for the state of Israel, but their disagreement and their distaste for the policies and the prime minister of Israel, that says a lot about the political room that people have to work in the space, as well as the knowledge and the understanding that Democratic primary voters have on this issue.
Great. So I have one question for the other three of you, and then I'm going to open it up for the remainder of our time together. And that is, last night Michelle Goldberg said something really interesting, which was that this could be the first election cycle in her memory, and the term she used is that this could be the first election cycle where a primary candidate for president pays a political price for not being in the center or center-left, progressive was her term, I'm going to use center or center-left, on Israel enough. Whereas the conventional wisdom of yore was that if you're not using the old playbook and you're hugging a Likud government, then you're going to pay a price, like Karen was alluding to, that this could be the first time where the opposite's true. And so I'd like to work through the three of you, starting with Karen, and see whether you would agree with that statement. And if yes, why? If not, why?
Actually, I do think that's true, because as a party, as Peter said, we're better. We're getting better, and I think, there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, right? When you try to say, "I'm for freedom," right, and then to say, "But those people don't get it," right? And I think the nature of the conversation, as I was saying before, because it's changed and because there is less political damage or risk at not saying what you really think, right? So I think it's very possible. And I think the other thing I would say is I think younger voters are part of moving this party more to the progressive, center-left, however you want to, particularly on issues like this, because, for them, again, it is cognitive dissonance, right? And I saw that a lot in 2016 with Bernie supporters in particular. And it was something that he and his team really fought hard to get into the platform of the Democratic Party. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that she's right, actually.
What do you think, Peter?
I agree. I think in some ways you could say the Democratic Party is on Israel and the Palestinians where the Republican Party in 2016 was on trade, which is to say there was a huge gap between party elites, who basically were relatively pro-free trade, and ordinary Republican Party voters who were actually pretty protectionist. And Donald Trump actually recognized that and leveraged that, right? And it was part of the reason he won the primary. I think Israel doesn't have this as much salience, and it's partly, again, because it's not on the front page as much these days, but I think there's a pretty substantial gap between where Democratic Party activists are and where Democratic Party leaders are. And I think that Bernie Sanders recognizes that there's an opportunity there because some of the other candidates, because of the way they're tied to various traditional Democratic Party notions on this, actually can't really meet and mobilize the base where it is. And I think that we'll see more perhaps when we get to the New York primary, when they come, when this debate usually kind of flares up. But I think we'll see actually that there's a tremendous potential for mobilization. I mean, let me ask just think about this very incendiary question. And I don't know if anyone has ever talked about questions that we don't, one of the things we don't know about public opinion is we don't know what people would say when we haven't asked them certain questions, right? So let me ask this very subversive question. You asked Democratic Party voters, would you prefer, I say this as a supporter of two states, would you support one state with equal rights for all, or would you support one state in which millions of Palestinians live as permanent non-citizens under military law, right? How do we think Democratic voters would actually answer that question? Nobody asks them that question, right? When someone even approaches to starting to ask them that question, right, then we potentially, the debate in the Democratic Party starts to shift pretty dramatically.
And Randy, what do you think?
So, look, I live in the world that is not always focused on Israel and the United States. You know, although at home we focus on it a lot. But she just left the room, but my wife is a congregational rabbi. So so as I'm listening to Karen and heard what Michelle said last night and Peter, I want to say something that I don't intend to mean as insulting, which is that I'm actually concerned that a lot of American Jews they don't even think about Israel anymore. I mean, it's not the issue that they vote on. And in fact, what is concerning to me is that Trump uses this issue more for evangelical purposes and what the import is there than we have in terms of Israel. So having said that, I do think that we're seeing not a big enough, but a pretty big shift towards holding Israel accountable for its lack of civil rights. The Democratic electorate is doing that, and you see that with people who are running for office and being more Democrats who are running and having more latitude on that and being willing to be more critical of how Israel treats its Palestinian citizens. I mean, I do think you're seeing that. I do think you hear it in all of what the candidates are saying. And I think Peter is right. It is not enough to say critical of Bibi Netanyahu, and it's not enough to be to say the obligatory "I'm for the two-state solution." Having said that, I think that the Democratic Party as a whole, you're going to see in the platform, and whoever is the nominee, is going to be far more left of center than the previous several nominees. And the issue then is how Trump will wedge this later on. So yes, I think we will move it. I think it's moving. I think we will keep on moving it. I think this will be, as someone who has sat at several, like Karen, at several platform committee debates. I have been on the drafting committee several times. There will be some intensity about this, but it is no longer people putting their head in the sand and pretending that there's no misdeeds in terms of civil rights or in terms of freedom. If it doesn't get to the Bernie Sanders position, will the Democrats, will the activists not vote in the election? You know, there'll be some activists that don't vote in the election, but the same is true in terms of Medicare for all. The same is true on any number of issues. And I do think it becomes incumbent on all of us in terms of the existential threat we face in 2020 to actually get as many people as we can off the sidelines and into voting. Half the voting population that could have voted last time didn't vote. And I think that we actually have, this is one, but the bigger arc is how do we make sure we have a justice and a freedom agenda in the United States of America that includes what is going on in terms of Israel.
Amen. So we have almost exactly a half hour left together. I'd like folks to have a chance to ask some questions. If you have a question, here's the rules. And I believe my mother, who was a second grade teacher at the Charles E. Smith Jewish Day School, is here, and she will help me enforce them. Please line up here. Please introduce yourself before you ask your question. Speak into the microphone. Please lead. I want the beginning, middle, and end to all be your question. And please direct your question at either all the panelists or an individual panelist and be clear about that. And thank you, everybody, for your interest. So let's go. Let's launch right ahead.
Hi, I'm Andy Winnick from the LA area. I've been studying and writing on this area for about 40 years. My question is very clear. I'm hearing the words, but I would like you to be really explicit. Are you really saying finally that we're going to use the word Palestinian? Not just justice, not just equality, not just fairness, not just two states, but that the Democratic Party candidates can be pushed, that we should push them to use the word Palestinian rights. That's my question.
Let's dive right in. Let's just pitch it to everybody. So if, Peter, do you want to start with that one?
Yes.
Randy, do you want to go?
Yes.
Karen?
Yeah, it's about time.
Jim?
Yes, I think the Democratic Party and candidates are very much ready to talk about Palestinian rights and use the words Palestinian. That, I think, is actually easier than some of the other things that we're talking about for most candidates.
J Street endorses this message. So that was a good example about how to ask a question, be efficient in your answer. So let's keep going. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alana. I live in DC. My question picks up on, is for all the panelists, what Randy said about how President Trump will weaponize charges of anti-Semitism against whoever the Democratic nominee is in the general, whether their views are quite progressive on Israel or whether they're not. They'll accuse them of being anti-Semitic if they have any somewhat progressive position on Israel. What's effective messaging to push back on that that's not actually anti-Semitism taking a just position on Israel?
And your question's for Randy? For everyone. For everybody. Well, let's start with Randy since you made this statement.
You know, I really want to say sticks and stones make, but, you know, I am a little concerned. I'm going to riff off your question, I hope, because there's different ways of actually, one can say, no, I'm not an anti-Semite, but there's different ways of answering the question. But it's all a matter of framing. And what I am concerned about is the false equivalencies that have been happening right now. Like, it is really different, and I don't mean to say this in any way as we are celebrating or honoring the year anniversary of Tree of Life. It's really different when a white nationalist, a white supremacist, then takes military weapons and kills people, whether it's in El Paso or in Pittsburgh, versus somebody saying that, you know, if you believe so much about progressive values and equality, you're an anti-Semite. And I do actually think we have to, in the tone that I'm using, there's a big thing that you learn as a school teacher. It's not what's said, it's what's heard. And finding a way when you can engage people in the debate and figure out a way of saying, whatever it is, you know, I would say, I'm not sure if you actually believe in equality or believe in freedom, or, you know, just like I fought against the Jim Crow laws, you know, didn't that still make me a patriot? Or something like, you know, something like that. You find a way to get the other person to engage. There's going to be 10 or 20% of people, and I see this in my own union, we have like 25% of our members voted for Trump. It's down to, in the polling that we've done, it's down to 20. Hopefully we'll get it down to 10 or something like that next time. But there'll still be people like that. And you're not going to get to everyone. That's part of the reason why this kind of game changing or this kind of arc is really important. But finding a way to engage people in the debate instead of just escalating it, and finding a way to stop the false equivalencies. White nationalism, racism that becomes incitement to violence is a whole lot different. And we have to actually not say that somebody who believes that other people have rights like Palestinians, that's not anti-Semitic. That's actually being really, really Jewish.
Does anyone else want to chime in quickly before we keep going?
I would
Jim?
say that the idea that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic is, if that were the case, everybody in Israel would be an anti-Semite. Okay, and I don't mean, I mean, but I don't mean to make a joke about it because it is the 1-year anniversary of the shooting at Tree of Life, and the attempt from Trump and, frankly, his Republican allies in Congress to make this false equivalency between criticism of Israel and somebody going in and shooting up a synagogue. This is the kind of thing that may actually move even more Jews into voting Democratic than in the past, which is hard because there's so many of them already. But this is what I was getting at earlier when I said there may be something particularly relevant from a Jewish voter perspective, but it is something that I think is important for people to educate broadly beyond the Jewish population, that this is, to make this false equivalency is, it's dangerous, and it's ridiculous, and it needs to be called out.
I would just say, I think that Trump and many on the Republican right don't really understand the Jewish tradition. They see Jews as a tribe, and they say, okay, you're a tribe, you got this other tribe you're fighting on, we're on your side. So case closed, right? What they don't understand is we're not just a tribe, right? We're actually a people that was brought in the world with an ethical message for the world, right? We read this week, we read yesterday Parsha Breshit, right? One of the things you may notice about Parsha Breshit is there are no Jews in that story, right? It's 20 generations, right, to get from Adam to Abraham, right? It's 2,000 years according to the biblical counting, right? Actually, they say 1948. That's 1,940 years. There are no Jews, right? It's a story about the inherent value of human beings, right? Of humanity. Ooh.
I think it's a locust.
All right. Right. I was going to say, I don't know what the symbolism there, I can't quite get my hand around. Right. The point is, I think that they don't understand why only 18% of Jews voted for Donald Trump, even though most of us are considered white, and even though we're a fairly prosperous and privileged public. It doesn't make any sense to them. They wouldn't do that, right? They don't understand why the American Jewish community was at the forefront of the civil rights movement, even though it could have very easily sat back, right? But most of us actually understand, right? Because Randy said, we understand because we remember, right? The truth is that the Jewish people, the story of Genesis is a story of a family, but the Jews only become a people in slavery, right? Why do the Jews need to go to Egypt anyway? They're already in the land of Israel. Why don't they just stay there, right? What does the story have to take this massive detour, right, where they go and become slaves in the land of Egypt and then come back, right? So some rabbis say it's because we didn't want to hold power. God didn't want us to hold power, right, until we had experienced bondage. Right? So that's who we are, or at least most of us are as a people, and that's why it's not inconsistent for us to speak up for Palestinians as human beings with inalienable rights, right? That's what it means to be a Jew. If being Jewish were just to be a member of one tribe among many, it wouldn't be worth very much, right? And so that's, I think, the story we have to tell to those people who don't understand it.
I tend to go to very practical. You all have a deeper knowledge than I do. I do tend to, Randy, I was a teaching assistant for a year, but I still go to, I'm not going to be lectured to about values and humanity by a man who calls a constitutionally protected process that is meant to save our democracy lynching, right? I mean, and I think that's one of the things about Trump, right? There's any number of places where, to my mind, it's also pointing out the hypocrisy. Like, why even let that side have any kind of validity in what they're saying when they undermine that every single day?
Next question.
Thanks to the panel. Without prejudging the outcome of the Democratic primary process. I wonder whether you could give us some more insight as to where Biden is on Israel and the Palestinians, and how far you think he will go towards the positions that we have been articulating and hearing here. By way of context, two very quick points. He addressed the J Street conference a number of years ago, Biden, and I think it was around Iran and the Iran deal, but he did seem comfortable more broadly addressing J Street. And he also went to Israel when they expanded the settlements. I believe he arrived the day that Israel announced an expansion of the settlements, and at that point, I understand that Hillary got on the phone and read the Riot Act to Bibi. So he does have some context and some background. So I wonder whether you could enlighten us a bit on Biden.
Peter, I'm going to pitch this one to you.
I think he has a long way to go. My fear is that, as perhaps with some other issues, he's locked in to a framework that has been built over many, many years, which is partly about my sense is it's perhaps more about the politics of this issue and his sense of where the Jewish community is, and that is, I think, out of date at this point. I certainly hope he has the capacity to rethink that, and it's our jobs to help him rethink that, but I have not seen any evidence so far.
I will just add from a J Street perspective that we have been in close touch with the Biden campaign and have a good relationship with him and his advisors. There are definitely distinctions, though, in terms of how far folks in the field, as Peter has observed, have gone and how far others have not yet gone. But let's move on to the next question.
But I also think,
Yeah, go ahead.
I think in all candor, there's also, and Peter alluded to this, there's a big difference between the Jewish Democratic donors, the big Jewish Democratic donors to the party, and where the non-donor base in the party is. And I just want to leave it there for a moment.
Okay, hi, my name is Hannah Powell. First of all, I just wanted to thank Peter for the pieces you've written about conditional aid. And I know a lot of us in this room are very excited for J Street to also embrace those positions. My question is for you, but also for anyone else. How can the progressive camp like us think that conditional aid or leveraging aid is possible when the Democratic Party platform doesn't even recognize the occupation?
Well, I guess I'll start. I mean, my hope is that will change this year, and I think J Street is making an effort for that to change. I think one of the things that sometimes progressive American Jews forget is that they look at polling with, the kind of great polling that you do, and it shows that American Jews are pretty progressive, and they think, well, that should translate into policy, right? But I think as people like everyone, the other people on my panel know even more than me because they actually work in active politics, what really matters is not necessarily what a community says in a poll, it's who shows up, right? And one thing to be said about the American Jewish right is that it tends to show up. It is not as spread as thin. Because those people are more tribal and less universalistic, they're less likely to be trying to balance their time between universal health care and climate change and Israel, right? They're just doing Israel, right? The other stuff, not so concerned, right? And so if, this is why I'm very happy with what If Not Now has been doing, with getting out there into the early primary states and posing this question. I think that the challenge for us this internal fight in the Democratic Party, because there are, as Randy's saying, there are other groups and there are institutionalized inside the Democratic Party, right, that are actually pushing very hard to basically maintain an AIPAC line inside the Democratic Party. And the question for us is essentially, are we willing to show up enough? A lot of, I think, American politicians, tell me if I'm wrong, basically their first experience with the American Jewish community is basically, they think what Jews want from them is basically Israel right or wrong. And it's actually a challenge for them to realize that you know what? They're actually Jews who share your values and actually want you to actually believe in the principles of Israel's Declaration of Independence rather than basically just saluting what the Israeli government does, right? But I think we have to be willing to exert ourselves as much as the people on the American Jewish right are, and I think ultimately that will be the test of whether we can make this possible. And we also have to legitimize Palestinian political participation, because one of the things the American Jewish right is doing very, very aggressively in a whole series of ways is an effort to silence and delegitimize Palestinian and Arab and Muslim political participation. We have to say, we need you in this political process, actually, because you're also part of this effort.
Jim, you wanted to go?
I would add that actually the first engagement that many candidates and many consultants and many people in that political ecosystem have with Israel is a trip and a briefing from an AIPAC affiliated organization. And that is, for everyone who's been to Israel, you know when you go, that is an educational experience depending on the perspective that you're getting. And I know that J Street had I think it's in its first or second year of starting these trips, but there is a lot of history and infrastructure to overcome here in making the changes that we're talking about. As you know, I work in the area of where are the people and whether it's Jewish voters, whether it's primary voters, whether it's general election voters, where are they? But that's very different from the education and what the first contact is for the elected officials that are involved in this process.
Great. So we have about 14 more minutes left, so let's be direct with the questions and hopefully we can get through as much here as possible. If not, some of us can hang around. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Tala, and I'm a J Street U leader at UCLA. I think we've kind of touched on this a little bit. Randy, you did so, but I want to kind of draw out this distinction between polling and funding. And Peter Beinart, in your book, The Crisis of Zionism, you tell this really interesting story about how Obama was raised with liberal Jewish values around him and was pretty left on Israel. But when he wanted to push in that direction, he saw kind of a pull in funding, not a fall, like a drop in polling from Jewish voters, but more so a pull in funding, which made him actually not that great on Israel at the end of the day. So I guess my question is, how much is polling truly influential for these presidential candidates, and will we need to see a major change in campaign finance laws in order to see a change that we truly wish to see in our electoral system?
And before we let whoever wants to get in on this get in, I just want to take moderator's prerogative for a second and talk for a second about how J Street has succeeded in balancing out some of that dynamic over the last decade. So last cycle, thanks to many of the folks in this room, J Street raised over $5 million for in hard money, 2 campaigns for our congressional endorsees. That is more, and this is my favorite talking point because my former boss here at J Street now works at MoveOn. That was more raised for candidates in hard money than MoveOn.org raised last cycle. And if you're running in one of the most competitive Senate seats, in one of the most competitive Senate races now in the country, and you're J Street endorsed, you can expect to raise well into the 6 figures from J Street supporters across the country if you get the endorsement. So a lot of this is balanced out thanks to, that's not to say that we don't have to change our campaign finance laws and the like, but a lot of this dynamic has balanced out over the last few years thanks to many of the good folks in this room. With that said, I will kick it to anybody who wants to get in on the panel here.
Look, we have to change campaign finance laws, but that means we have to change the Supreme Court of the United States of America. I mean, and so it's obscene the amount of money that's spent, but it's not just the amount of money for candidates. It's also the environment where truth doesn't matter. And where, if you're on Facebook, Facebook will do whatever, the kind of mistruths, the kind of, all of that. That's a whole number of 5 panels. But, the point is, candidates do look at this polling a lot. People look at polling. It's not like it's a zero-sum game. But we do actually have to recognize you can't fight something unless if you don't recognize what the forces are against us. And Peter said this about what happened in the last election on trade and where Trump went, and how, you see a whole bunch of people who said Obama Democrats then voted for Trump. There was a combination of the kind of economic frustration and supremacy that was endemic there that we have to actually understand. So yes, the polling is really important. The donors are really important. Winning an election is really important. But the advocacy that people are doing, it's the only reason from J Street and you and others, it's the only reason that this is moving. So give yourself a lot of props for it moving. Last thing I'll say is this. There's no magic wands in politics. One tweet is not going to change policy. There's a lot of work we have to do. Think about what's going on in terms of the entire civil rights movement and what you have now, from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, and how somebody like Trump would use the word political lynching to try to deal with, to try to actually push back in a way that was so horrible, duplicitous, hypocritical, whatever. But your work that you're doing in colleges all around, it's really, really important that you're sticking in the game and you're trying to make the game fair.
So in the interest of getting through as many questions as possible, let's go to the next one.
Okay, just a quick question. This was sort of alluded to in earlier discussions, but how can Democratic candidates talk about the influence of lobby groups like AIPAC and donors like Sheldon Adelson without opening themselves up to accusations of hurling anti-Semitic tropes or of anti-Semitism? Like, is there a way to talk about that in a safe way?
Anybody want to jump in on that first? Peter and then Karen.
There are certain, Maimonides said when he was asked why he studied astronomy from the idolatrous Greeks, he said, you take truth from whichever quarter it comes, right? Which is to say, there are certain things that are true, right? Was Bernie Madoff a walking anti-Semitic stereotype? Yes. It's also true he stole people's money, right? Are there anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews and money and undue influence? Of course there are. It's also true that Sheldon Adelson is incredibly influential with this administration and has an enormous impact on the Republican Party, on Israel, and particularly on the Trump administration. And not only should we be able to say that, we have to say that in order to actually describe reality, right? I'll be honest. I mean, the kinds of things that Ilhan Omar said, you can argue that she shouldn't have said in the right way, she shouldn't have said on Twitter. I used to, at Kesher Israel down the street here, I used to hear that at Kiddush every single week. People talking about the way, people worked in Congress, talking about the way American politics actually works on this issue. I think that what you should do when people talk about this is they should make a point of not only talking about the undue influence of money vis-a-vis Israel and people like Adelson. They should also talk about prescription drugs and the healthcare industry and the money that comes from the Gulf and all of these things, right? They should not just single out Jews and Israel, but within that larger context to talk about the role of money and the way in which that influences American foreign policy towards Israel. It's not only an acceptable conversation, it's an absolutely necessary conversation.
Karen, you want to get in?
This question is generally directed to everyone, but first, Randy, love the shirt, red for Ed. So I seem to remember back in the 70s a certain Democratic president meeting with a certain very pro-settlement Israeli prime minister and essentially saying, make a deal or we're cutting all the aid, no aid. And it turned out it worked, and it was called the Camp David Accords. So my question is to congressional candidates and to 2020 candidates in this cycle, if the discussion around diplomatic pressure towards Israel is not about cutting the aid, period. You don't get aid, you don't get funding for other stuff that you can then use to save money towards your military and your military acts of oppression. What does quote-unquote diplomatic pressure actually look like? Because a lot of Democratic candidates say, oh, I want to do diplomatic pressure, and it seems to amount to saying please.
Anybody want to jump in on that?
I'll just say very quickly, virtually every American president of the Cold War at one point or another threatened or actually withheld military aid to Israel, including Ronald Reagan, including Richard Nixon, including Dwight Eisenhower. This was the norm in American politics. And we don't generally think of Ronald Reagan as an anti-Semite, right? So again, we're partly talking about a normalization, a return to a kind of normalization of this discourse that I think that has been lost, and we've actually lost that history. It used to be, as a matter of course, when American presidents, although they were generally quite supportive of Israel, when Israel did things that they thought were fundamentally bad for American national interests and fundamentally hostile to American values, they would say, we really don't want you to do this, and if you do this, you may not get that next tranche of weapons. That was considered pretty much the norm.
And we'll get you in a second, Jim. And Karen, just a question in terms of how to politically message this. How can you talk about this dynamic in a way that's not singling one side out? Because what we see in Jim's polling, too, is that's very important in terms of currying favor, particularly among American Jews, that it doesn't have the feel of singling out Israel specifically, but the feel of using a tool that is being used across the board in foreign policy.
In terms of diplomacy, yeah. Well, the thing is, though, I sometimes feel like candidates, when they say diplomacy, it kind of can mean they're not really sure, to be perfectly honest. And so, and that's fine, because I think it tells us that a lot of these candidates need to have a better background knowledge and understanding of what the parameters would be and what the options would be. So, I mean, I would like to see candidates actually do that, and instead of just talking about diplomacy, say what does that mean, right? And then what else? And I don't think there has been that pressure to do so up until, you know, and we've kind of come back to this theme a lot, but it's so important that J Street has really helped to create a counterbalance, a counterweight to AIPAC, because that was the line that everybody followed for so long. Peter's right, we've forgotten our history. But again, this is also part of the influence of money, right? Because you will see candidates also be careful about what they say, because this may be where voters are, but my donors, I'm going to have trouble with these big donors if I don't, walk that fine line. So I think the more we can give people language in terms of how, to your question, okay, so sanctions, what would that be? Why not say, you have to spend it on American-made products, right? Or for military aid. Why not?
And Jim, do you want to get into some of the
Just
data?
a couple of things. One is, it's not about polling necessarily as it is campaigns. So when we're not polling for J Street, we do a lot of House and Senate and governor's races and city council and everything. In 2008, when J Street was just getting started, we would get calls from campaigns about what to say about Israel or their position papers, and it was completely divorced from where we are today. Today we get calls from campaigns, hey, how do I get J Street's endorsement? Hey, this is our statement on the Iran agreement. What do you think? And you look at it, and it reads like the J Street website. And I think it's important to recognize the change that has happened as a result of J Street's presence, but education and everything, that campaigns are changing. And this playing field is very different. And so while we may not see it in every single presidential debate, we are getting there on a lot of different places, in a lot of different important elections. I think the fact that the Democrats took over the House in 2018, and a lot of those candidates were informed on this issue by J Street, is really, really important. And that we will see, and those people got elected to the House in 2018. All you have to do is listen to them to know that they are going to be going places and leading this country for a long time. I mean, this is a very impressive group of people, and that they've gotten their education in the right place. No, go ahead.
I just also want to, as we're thinking about history, I just want to say something about that group of people. You could have had an existential threat within the Democratic Party after, Trump used something that Representative Omar said, and then there was a weekend where maybe there was going to be a censure of Omar, and then what ended up happening is a whole bunch of progressives and a whole bunch of the Jewish members kind of got together over a course of a few days, and they came out with a really different resolution that was about inclusion and about actually understanding and seeing people's pain, but also thinking about and leaning into equality and justice. And that is the difference in terms of the Democratic Party right now. It could have gone, and it was going really badly for a moment. And you could have seen what Peter said earlier about the tribes is so true in terms of people thinking about Jews like other people within American politics. But it really went differently, and a lot of that is because of not just some of the new people who were there, but some of the other folks like a Jerry Nadler, like a Jamie Raskin, and like a Karen Bass. People really worked together to say, let's actually lean into our values and figure out what to do and to talk to each other. And I was really proud of Nancy Pelosi's House Democrats that moment, more than almost any other moment, but they were able to do that.
Important point to add. So we have 2 questions left. Let's get right to the question. We'll take both at once, and we'll get as much out of our panelists as we can. We have 1 minute left, so
Sure.
go ahead.
My name is Jack, and I'm a senior at Johns Hopkins University. My question is for Karen in particular. If you're advising a presidential candidate in a general election or a canvasser, and oftentimes you just have one line about Israel, what should that line be? Should we fight this on human rights? Should we fight it on national security? Should we fight it on American values? What should be the first thing out of your mouth?
If I'm a candidate or if I'm talking to the candidate?
I'd-
Just wasn't sure what you said on that
I'd
part.
say if you're a candidate or if you're anybody and you have one line for the general public, what's the most salient argument?
So for that, I would probably call J Street first to make sure the polling is still with me.
That's the right answer. There's definitely a right and wrong answer.
Which, by the way, is exactly what I did on that weekend that Randy was talking about when we were all, because we were all struggling with how to talk about this. I think I would go with what Randy said. I think you make a values-based argument, and I think you make as Peter said earlier, it's not enough to just say two-state solution, right? You've got to be able to talk about the Palestinians and Palestinian rights, and I think if you talk about that, particularly in 2020, I will say, because it is not a joke that Trump has really frightened people in ways around race and religion in ways I haven't seen in my lifetime. I mean, in focus groups, people bring it up unprompted, how just more afraid they feel. They feel more, particularly African Americans, afraid for their children, right? And afraid of the toxic environment. So I actually think in 2020 in particular, starting from values is the right place, because I think that's what people are focused on a bit, this idea of who are we? What are our values? I really believe that. And then I think you have to be prepared to have a second line, right, to talk a little bit further about what you would do.
If I could just try to boil that into a sentence, I would say something along the lines of, ultimately, Israeli Jews are not safe and free unless Palestinians are also safe and free.
Okay.
And our last question.
Okay. I'm Diane Proman. Hi. All right. Thank you so much for bringing up the issue about messaging and framing. It is so important, and it's the least expensive thing that we can do that has the most power. And the Republicans are so much better at that, and they, play on fear, humiliation, and so I think our messaging, not just values and not just rational arguments and not facts, but we need. There's a lot of concrete black and white thinking and socialism and the squad and all of this. So question is about, as an educator, your thoughts about targeting, specific messaging to sort of to touch people where they are emotionally and to counter the powerful manipulation on the other side.
So, I guess, all of these things. What Peter just said, I think is really great framing. But I also think that it's going to be, as we get closer and closer to the election, the issue is, we can believe in an Israel that has a right to exist as a Jewish democratic state, but it better be democratic for all and have civil rights for all. And we can believe in freedom and security, but we have to believe in freedom and security for all. And you can, I don't, in this room, J Street still believes in, others still believe in a two-state solution. It's going to be navigating through all of this stuff is going to be very, very difficult. But at the end of the day, when one starts, that it is not pitting security versus freedom is been the battle that we have fought for our entire lives. You can believe both in freedom and security, and I would argue you have security if people have freedom.
That's the perfect note to end on. So please join me in thanking our panelists, Randy Weingarten, Peter Beinart, Karen Finney, and Jim Gerstein. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to seeing you throughout the conference.